Adaptation is hard. Adapting a novel into a movie can go terribly wrong. Adapting a graphic novel into a movie can also be difficult. And we don't need to convince anyone that adapting video games to movies has proven challenging. But adapting a graphic novel into a movie which itself cribs its visuals from video games? Whoa. This was the challenge facing writer-director Edgar Wright when he set out to adapt the Scott Pilgrim graphic novels into the 2010 film Scott Pilgrim vs. the World. And if we look at the initial box office results, it's easy to come to the conclusion that he truly failed. But today we're here to argue that Wright did it masterfully, that he took the video game aesthetic of the graphic novel, which could have functioned as no more than a lame gimmick, and married it perfectly with the conventions of cinematic storytelling. The resulting movie is a fascinating hybrid that can help us understand something fundamental about both video games and film. So let's find out how in this Wisecrack edition on Scott Pilgrim vs. the World. And of course, spoilers ahead for Scott Pilgrim and Zelda: A Link to the Past. Yeah, the SNES one. But first, a quick recap. Scott Pilgrim can best be described as a hyperkinetic action rom-com about 22-year-old Scott Pilgrim, bass player of the Toronto-based garage band Sex Bomb. At the beginning of the movie, Scott announces that he's dating a high schooler, Knives Chow, much to his friends' disapproval. But when magenta-haired dream girl Ramona Flowers skates into his life, Scott decides to dump his seriously too young girlfriend so he can be with Ramona, breaking Knives' heart. Unfortunately for Scott, dating Ramona means defeating her 7 evil exes, who range from a pirate accompanied by demon hipster chicks, to a preppy vegan, to dragon summoning keyboard twins. Eventually, Scott and Ramona break up, and Ramona gets back together with her final evil ex, indie record exec Gideon, who signed Scott's band without him. Of course, Scott finally has to fight Gideon man to man, and in doing so realizes that he isn't actually fighting for Ramona, he's fighting for himself, and even Knives returns to help him explode Gideon into a painful-looking rainstorm of quarters. Knives gives Scott and Ramona her blessing, and they walk off into the sunset, or in this case a door that leads to nothingness and or the Toronto skyline.
Wow.
So, besides being based on a graphic novel characterized by a video game aesthetic, why did the movie have to look like a video game? Well, it all has to do with a concept mostly unique to video games called knowledge acquisition. Basically, games start off easy and get harder as they go along because the player learns and improves. So a noob can pick up a game and learn to play it, but at its final levels, the game is still challenging and fun for experts. But first, video games have to teach players how to play the game. For example, in Super Mario Bros., the first level teaches a new player the basics, how to move from left to right, jump, collect coins and mushrooms, and stomp on Goombas. All skills the player will need as they encounter more elaborate levels and more difficult bosses. Knowledge acquisition is relevant to Scott Pilgrim in a number of ways, but let's start with a similar concept: exposition. In a movie, the exposition is designed to teach the audience how to watch the movie. And for most movies, filmmakers are able to rely on the audience's basic knowledge of filmmaking technique within a given genre, enabling directors and writers to use shorthand. Shorthand in a movie looks like this. It's rainy and dark, the movie is scary. Some dude has a scar on his face, he's the bad guy.
I get it. The German guy, Mr. Scar, must be the bad guy. Well, you know how I got this scar? Saving a Jewish girl from a gang of skinheads.
Oh, Jesus.
Yeah!
These kinds of signals help the audience understand who everybody is, what the world is like, and whether we're supposed to be laughing or crying. Shorthand essentially helps us skip past the lower levels of most movies.
Was that not clear? Was that not clear?
Through a lifetime of watching movies, you've built up a vocabulary of shorthand, so when you watch a new film, the filmmaker can work off the shorthand established by other films. They don't necessarily have to hold your hand like this is your first time playing Mario. But in the case of Scott Pilgrim, Edgar Wright set out to conceptually blur the lines between a movie and a video game. And there wasn't any video game movie hybrid shorthand for him to rely on. We aren't used to seeing and hearing video game graphics and sounds popping up in film. So Wright brilliantly solves this problem by borrowing cues from video games to create a new kind of shorthand. It starts in the very first frame, with the Universal logo accompanied by 80s-style MIDI music. Other examples include the character intro graphics, visual sound effects, and the P-bar. These familiar video game symbols may be disorienting at first, but they ultimately help us get ready for something we've never seen before. This is a movie about a hero whose growth mirrors the growth of a player playing a video game. Let's get the obvious similarities out of the way. In both video games and movies, we need to know the goal. In Mario, it's simply to get to the right side of the screen and narratively to defeat Bowser and rescue the princess. In Scott Pilgrim, Scott's goal shows up around the 30-minute mark wearing way too much eyeliner, the first of Ramona's evil exes.
Wait! We're fighting over Ramona?
Didn't you get my email explaining the situation?
And in order to be with Ramona, Scott has to defeat all 7 of her evil exes. What he doesn't know is that achieving this external goal will require an internal change too. In traditional narrative theory, like the hero's journey, the goal of a protagonist can usually only be reached when the hero learns to change something fundamental about him or herself. And in the case of Scott Pilgrim, Scott's internal change is that he needs to learn to confront and move on from the past. And not just Ramona's past, which is physically and literally trying to defeat him, but his own past.
She told me it was mutual.
She dumped him. It was brutal.
Problem is, in real life and in stories, people can't just change something about themselves. They have to go on a journey toward the goal, culminating in a crisis which teaches them a lesson. And that journey is what a story is. But modern narrative theorist John York suggests that the big change achieved at the crisis of a larger story is actually the result of smaller incremental changes at every step on the journey, and that each one of these smaller changes is also the result of this paradigm of change. In other words, each sequence in a movie needs to be a little mini-story, or what York calls a fractal, a small piece that reflects the structure of the whole. Goal, crisis, lesson. And this concept is actually a perfect explanation of how video games work. In a video game, a level or a boss fight creates a fractal narrative for the player that ultimately ends in further knowledge acquisition. Since the movie uses Zelda sound cues, it's perhaps only appropriate to illustrate this point with the SNES classic A Link to the Past. If the mini goal is to defeat the boss or complete the dungeon, the crisis is the challenge of beating it, and the lesson is the new knowledge or skill a player takes away after victory. So for instance, let's take a look at the second dungeon, the Eastern Palace. In it, Link acquires a bow. At the end, you're faced with a mini goal, in this case defeating the boss of the dungeon, the Armos Knights. Thing is, these dudes are really hard to kill. Link has to slash them 16 times with his sword to kill each one. If you were like me, you probably tried this and failed. So you have a crisis, and then you experiment, and discover that you can defeat each knight with a measly 3 arrows, and you've got yourself a lesson. Defeating enemies like them is easier with the bow. This kind of goal crisis lesson happens throughout the game as players learn different skills which they'll use later. And importantly, this lesson will be critical for achieving the ultimate goal, defeating Ganon. Similarly, since Scott's growth reflects the growth a player undergoes during the course of playing a video game, each one of the evil exes Scott has to defeat is a boss that presents a mini goal, which begets a crisis, which teaches him a valuable skill and inches him further along toward the central goal. These fractals parallel video game challenges and result in the knowledge acquisition that Scott will need in order to defeat the final level or boss. In Scott's case, Ramona's 7th and most powerful evil ex, Gideon. For example, in his first fight with Matthew Patel, Scott learns to use his strength and fists to win the battle, and it's relatively easy, because he's feeling confident in his relationship with Ramona. But then Scott has to face down skateboarder, stuntman, and cut-rate action star Captain America. I mean, Lucas Lee.
You think you stand a chance against an A-lister, bro?
In order to defeat Lucas, Scott's strength fails because he's completely overmatched. So in the process of fighting Lucas, Scott goes through a crisis when he seems to be losing. He's forced to improvise, so he tricks Lucas into grinding down a deadly rail with like 200 steps because girls are watching. This teaches Scott a lesson. In addition to his strength, he will also need to use his wits to defeat the League of Evil Exes. Just like in a video game, this fractal has provided Scott, the player, with the new knowledge and skills he will need going forward.
He totally bailed. I didn't get his autograph.
So while you may think that the bow is your secret weapon in defeating bosses, you'll find out that the boss of the Desert Palace is quite resilient to the bow, but weak to the ice rod. Thus, the player walks away with a new lesson that makes him a more well-rounded player. As such, just like in video games, things get harder as Scott's journey continues. When Ramona makes a casual comment about his hair,
Your hair's pretty shaggy.
Scott loses confidence and spirals into self-doubt, hats, and horrifying flashbacks involving his own evil ex, Captain Marvel. Envy. So even though Scott is making progress toward his external goal, his internal journey isn't going so well. Scott has made 2 incremental changes toward confronting Ramona's past, but he still hasn't confronted his own. Soon though, Scott has a new mini-goal when he's forced to fight Ramona's 3rd evil ex and Envy's current boyfriend, Todd. To defeat Todd, Scott has to pass through another crisis and learn another lesson: how to trick a vegan into drinking a latte.
You just drank half and half, baby.
This is a more sophisticated application of wits, but this battle also involves the new tactic of Scott using his talent to fight Todd on the base. And with each new X, this pattern continues as Scott learns from each fractal, acquiring the new knowledge he will need and getting better at using the skills he's already learned. Scott is working his way up through the levels, bosses, or dungeons of his video game. Simultaneously, each battle presents Scott with an internal crisis, inching him toward the moment in which he will have to fully confront his past in order to move on from it.
You kicked my heart in the ass, so guess we're even.
In York's model, the story arc is specifically framed as a journey of knowledge acquisition. A character begins with no knowledge, moves through fractal phases as he or she gains knowledge, and finally arrives at a place of total mastery. In Scott Pilgrim, everything in the movie prepares Scott to physically fight and defeat Gideon. He's acquired strength, wits, talent, and teamwork. This is not unlike in A Link to the Past, when in the final dungeon, you must fight the first 4 bosses of the game before your final confrontation with Ganon. And going into his fight with the ultimate boss, Gideon, Scott passes through one more crisis, when he loses Ramona and finds the resolve to fight for her, giving him the power of love. But York's model is also a model of change. And on his internal journey, Scott is still not ready to make the big change. There is still one X to defeat: himself. At the beginning of the story, Scott breaks Knives' heart by leaving her for Ramona, and he isn't honest with either one of them about it. Scott himself is an evil ex. So even though Scott has acquired all the knowledge he needs to physically fight Gideon, Gideon still defeats him because he hasn't yet admitted that he was wrong. In York's narrative model, this is the final internal crisis, when Scott has to apply all the lessons he's learned about himself so far and regain his self-esteem.
I feel like I learned something.
Wright represents this opportunity with a classic video game symbol, an extra life. If we apply this to A Link to the Past, all the skills you learned fighting the various bosses come back and are embodied in the fight with Ganon. The Armos Knights move in an outward circular motion like Ganon's fire bats. The Land Molas attack diagonally like Ganon's trident. Both the Moldorm and Ganon fights run the risk of falling off the level, and Ganon teleports just like a Ganon. So when Scott comes back, we see York's total mastery. Scott has realized that he needs to apologize for being a bad boyfriend and fight Gideon on his own behalf.
I cheated on you. I cheated on both of you. I'm really sorry.
And when he does, he gains the power of self-respect, his final lesson, which turns out to be the ultimate weapon against Gideon and the culmination of all the incremental changes Scott has been experiencing. York's fractal pieces build to the whole, just as the video game of this movie guides Scott to the knowledge he needs to defeat the final boss and change. Looks like Edgar Wright knew what he was doing after all. By using both the way video games look and also how they teach players along the way, Wright has created the perfect marriage of style and structure. Scott Pilgrim vs. the World doesn't look like a video game just to be cool, even though it does look cool. It also teaches us something about the ways we acquire knowledge and the incremental changes we all have to go through, whether trying to achieve a goal, like kicking Jason Schwartzman's teeth in and winning the girl of your dreams, or telling a story. But what do you think? Is this the best Edgar Wright movie? Is there another way to read the video game aesthetic? Let us know in the comments, and thanks to all our patrons who support the channel and our podcasts. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button